Hello and welcome. I am Radagast, and this is Global Mission of Peace show, Mystic View, and I am joined here with my co-host, Shelley. Hello, Shelley.
Hello, everyone.
And we have a guest that we're quite pleased to have with us, and that is Dan Winter, who will speak with us about implosion, bliss, longitudinal waves, and other great topics that if you followed Dan Winter at all, we'll just kind of pick it up and get it going in the conversation. Welcome, Dan Winter.
Hello, nice to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, so Dan, if you would please just describe your book, your newest book, because you have quite a few, and also how that ties into Theraphi, which myself and some of our viewers and some of our members have personally experienced. I'm sure we'd all love to hear.
Well, thank you for inviting. And yes, my new book is called Fractal Spacetime, Origin of Biologic Negentropy. And we claim to have discovered the origin of negentropy, which is the opposite of entropy, meaning the origin of self-organization in biology. And the reason it's called fractal spacetime will emerge because that origin of negentropy is basically a caduceus, which is golden ratio wavelengths, which leads down to the Planck length and time, which is the universal musical key signature of all of mass in physics. So if you take the universal key signature of matter in physics, Planck length and time, and use my new equation called origin of biologic negentropy, you get the wavelengths of the Schumann harmonics, the brainwave harmonics for bliss, the harmonics we use for Theraphi, the exact two frequencies motorizing photosynthesis, duration of Earth year and Venus year, the HRV, LF, and HF, the frequency of ADP, the radii of hydrogen, basically all negentropic phenomena, the self-organization. The term for that is called phase conjugate negentropic implosive collapse. And what that means is, since those are the frequencies of brainwaves during bliss, is that your brain is actually doing that implosive collapse, and that creates the focus. The sorting of phases called conjugation of phases based on golden ratio, which is actually the physics of perception. And we believe actually we can prove it's the cause of gravity. And all of that is very powerful and, cutting edge physics, except we think we have proof that it's rejuvenating and negentropic because we put those frequencies into plasma, the Theraphi.net, and it appears to work. Hundreds of people have had those experiences. So we're quite excited. Thank you.
That is very exciting. And so how do you teach this? How do you teach through either meditation or through just direct experience with the Theraphi device?
Yes, how to achieve bliss is the right question. And, my first book was called Implosion, Secret Science of Ecstasy and Immortality. And for that book, we were using my first brainwave invention, which used exactly those frequencies in brainwaves to create a teaching environment with audio feedback cues called the Bliss Tuner to teach bliss experience. And what we did find, for example, is a lady, we were doing her brainwave feedback there in Australia, and before lunch, she was not able to get that golden ratio alpha to beta, implosive collapse for bliss in her brainwaves. She went out with a shaman during lunch and processed some trauma, serious trauma actually, came back after lunch and had this incredible bliss experience where 5 harmonics in the brainwaves, alpha, beta, theta, all in golden ratio. And so it's clear, we can prove when bliss happens, and with feedback cues help that, but it doesn't mean you don't have to do your own work. And that whole system, by the way, will soon be coming out for iOS, iPhone, flameinmind.com, inexpensively, coming soon.
Yes, and I keep looking for that. And where do we find that? Because I'm looking in the typical places like, the iTunes store or something. Where are we going to find that?
Well, our first iOS app is called heartsring.com, and that's doing well on the iPhone store. But now we're having a major breakthrough and advancement on the HRV, which is heart breath entrainment and compassion empathy entrainment and breath coherence, heart coherence training. That will now be iThrive.com, ithrve.com. And the introduction to that is at hrv-app.com. heartbiofeedback.com. So that major new, it will be the most powerful heart biofeedback software out there, period. It really, sorry to say this, but walks circles around HeartMath Institute for teaching heart coherence and all that, and replaces the old heart tuner. It will be inexpensive. It'll be released on the iPhone store in about 1 to 2 months, but the previews are there at the websites I mentioned. Then a few months after that, maybe 6 months, the brainwave part of that complement, which can be used with cues in synergy for iOS, and already the intro is at flameinmind.com.
All of them coming out of the language that you're using, because I like to take a lot of the concepts that we use when we say things and make sure that people who are listening really understand what they're listening to. So like something like phase conjugation is a phrase. Now, for me, what I would do is I would take anybody who has studied a foreign language, because when you speak a language natively, a lot of times you don't understand what to conjugate a verb means, really. You kind of learn that you conjugate verbs in other languages. But the whole thing is you have this basic, like a verb, and to conjugate it is to shift it so it kind of fits into language. It has a certain coherence, rather than just this block concept of like to go, it's like I go, we go, and how we conjugate things. So I'm guessing that phase conjugation is introducing a like you have these phases, and there's a kind of a coherence and language to this to these phases that permit an intelligence to flow, so it's not just waves and patterns and angles. Would this be somewhat correct?
That's a beautiful and useful metaphor, actually. To conjugate a verb is to establish its phase relationship in time, past, present, and future. Sum est, sumus est, sunt, to be, etc. So your relationship to the phases of time is established when you conjugate a verb. Now, but when you do phase conjugation in physics, we're actually doing the same thing. We're establishing a very delineated sequence of phases in time. And specifically, in fact, I'm just going to grab the book here 1 second. Well, just to say that, so the picture on the cover of the book, which is you see the caduceus there.
Yes.
So the root of that caduceus is the dimension Planck, length, and time. Now, if you take the Planck unit of time and do whole number exponents of golden ratio, you get the perfect caduceus, which, is hermetic, and it is hermetically sealed, as it were. But the reason that's called phase conjugation in physics is because the phases in time add and multiply recursively, constructively, coming to that point, literally to conjugate, literally exactly making the only possible perfect three-dimensional fractal. That if you take that same golden ratio caduceus cascade in 3D, you get the stellated dodecaecosa, we call it the Star Mother kit, which I have newly proven is precisely the radii of hydrogen. And we take that frequency series for Theraphi, et cetera. So phase conjugation creates fractality because the adding and multiplying recursively, constructively, which only golden ratio makes, wave fractal, which is the first time electrical engineers defined a fractal field. Fractality was known to be infinite compression mathematically, but we're the first to define what a fractal field is. And having applied that to Theraphi, we see that that creates the centripetal force, which is sorts. So that Planck time, for example, times exponents golden ratio and Planck length gives you exactly the wavelengths of photosynthesis. And there's only 2 frequencies that make it go. So photosynthesis and bliss work because they're implosive, negentropic collapse. That's why I call phase conjugation. So phase conjugation was first discovered in optics, where you had 4-wave mixing on lasers, and they had self-organization and time reversal. We're the first to apply phase conjugation to magnetics and dielectrics, and actually now to plasma. Although in phase conjugate optics, it was known that noble gases were phase conjugate optically, and we are using those in the Theraphi. So anyway, but that's a good start to think about conjugation. And the ancients called it the caduceus. They called it a symbol of life, and they were right.
I find it interesting that you're mentioning about the noble gases, because my understanding of what made the Rife technology work, because when he first experimented, he wasn't getting the results he wanted, but when he passed the frequencies through a noble gas in a tube is when they obtained the kind of coherence that he needed.
That's a good insight. The physics is that the more broad spectral the phase conjugation, the more negentropic. And that starts actually with Dardick's work when he proved that harmonic inclusiveness predicts the longevity of anything in the universe, from babies, atoms, to galaxies, universes. So your heart rate variability, the more harmonics present, literally the more you have an immune system and the longer you're going to live. It's strictly mathematics. Harmonic inclusiveness is perfected by fractality, non-destructive compression, literally phase conjugation. So the more you get the harmonics to converge non-destructively, and obviously golden ratio is the only solution to that problem, the more you get more frequencies present at once. So you use the low frequency harmonic recipe on the cover of my book, and then you use the high frequency component, and that's what we do accurately, and that's what's expensive to do, to phase lock that very accurately, the high frequencies and the optical conjugation in the noble gases. The reason, incidentally, that noble gases are optically conjugate is because their outer valence electron shells, what makes them noble, is literally the DF subshell completion, icosahedrodeca non-destructive jitterbug phase conjugate collapse. So that's the physics of superconductivity. There's a whole bunch of things about noble gases and monoatomics that are related to phase conjugation.
That's so very cool. The slipknot of perfect fusion, right? So
yes, that's what it is. Yes. And you know, it's funny because in Star Trek they said, you know, the dilithium crystals, Captain. And actually what they meant was lithium niobate is a phase conjugator. And we actually have the technology to produce propulsion with that. It's a phase conjugate pump wave, and that was actually called the Koski frost. And so we have a technology for propulsion based on this as well.
Well, you said it's the heart of hydrogen. Well, also the heart of sun, also the heart of humans. Okay, and I don't want to bring us right back to track if this takes us away, but because we just recently did a show on water, I have to ask, what is the heart of oxygen?
Well, you see, originally when Leadbeater and Besant wrote Occult Chemistry, Psi Perception of Quarks, to see the clairvoyant inspection of the atomic structures, they saw the heart of hydrogen as what they call the anu, which is a slipknot. It has 5 spins inside, 7 spins outside, and which turns out to be a metaphor for the 5 spin symmetries of dodecacosa surrounding or embedded inside the 7 spin symmetries of tetracube. And that is quite literally accurately what is seen clairvoyantly at the heart of the sun and the 7 layers of the human heart muscle, and also then the 7 arrows of the tetrahedron, which is the origin of Hebrew and Sanskrit. And so that's all, the animations are all at 7arrows.net, which is also has shamanic implications, because if you visualize those 7 arrows properly, then your plasma body can inhabit a cube of space, and that gives you the leverage to throw your weight around, literally, to be a shaman. So that is the perfect slipknot, and it is the origin of the human heart muscle, and you know, the heart of hydrogen and the heart of the sun. So it's basically, you're right, it's the perfect slipknot. And the reason that's the origin of Hebrew is because you take that flame letter and simply look at its shadows of this spiral on the torus, which self-organizes in the golden spiral on the torus, and look at it from those 7 arrows of the tetra. The shadows are Hebrew and Sanskrit. goldenmean.info/DNA ring, which is basically propulsion vectors to steer your plasma body, because when you die and when you dream, that's all you are, is a plasma donut. And so to be able to steer them, it's just like an astronaut needs to see which direction to squirt his jets. So when you focus your mind on one Hebrew letter, what you're doing basically is controlling the angle of the toroid of the plasma of the upper cortex, which is literally blowing smoke rings at very specific angles. Now, if you throw those smoke rings, which is the charged donut domains of your optical cortex, at the correct sequence of angles, when they converge in the center of the magical square, Ophanim ritual, for example, they implode, they conjugate, and that's called casting a spell. And it literally, that centripetal force you then generate is the physics of magic. And it is a symmetry operation set, plasma propulsion vectors. And we have all that animated in terms of the physics of propulsion at fractalfield.com/propulsion.
And that takes us straight to the shaman. And what does shaman mean?
Exactly. Yes. Thank you. Well, you know, we talked about that, the word Shem, as in Sitchin's work. I will raise a Shem unto the Lord. He translates Shem to mean highward, fire, stone. We now know what, because Shem was then translated to mean the altar in the church. We now know what actually it means. It means implosive capacitance, literally, or the generation of a bioactive field. So the ancient Sumerians were desperate because of their catastrophic premature aging, arriving here in a non-conjugate field, to create a Shem unto the Lord, which is to say a rejuvenation field. So a rejuvenation biologic field is the definition of the religious concept of building an altar. It's the only definition. It requires electrical engineering. And that's what a Shem until Lord was. What you could also transliterate Shem, Highward Firestone, to mean access to an electrical black hole or access to centripetal force. So then when in the book Seeds of Knowledge, they prove that a Stonehenge stone circle would cause seeds to grow and enable shaman to plasma project, which is to say to take memory through birth and death, and also, access to survival memory, access to ancestral memory has tremendous survival value. So the whole tradition, which is called Boheme, Arcadia, Hypogeum, the Coneheads, the Hermetic skill of building a bioactive field was the essence of survival memory. So these people are trying to interpret sacred sites and don't know what a bioactive field are functionally clueless. They need to read bioactivefield.com, and then they'll understand why Sam in Bosnia, who just got 500,000 people a year coming to the Bosnian pyramids for rejuvenation effect, he just ordered a Theraphi because he understands that you can climax the bioactive rejuvenation field. So that's what the shaman we've had who have had the Theraphi experience confirm that you basically experience a wormhole. And a wormhole is neither good or bad. It's something you can use if you have the skill to project your plasma coherently. Mm-hmm. It starts with the skill to lucid dream, which also predicts ability to take memory through death.
I remember through reading Lawrence Gardner's work, and he kind of mentioned, he seemed to indicate that the Shem also indicate, there used to be these little piles that you would see, especially in the Egyptian things, look like little cones. And they were piles of stone. He said that was monatomic gold.
Actually, the monatomic gold was served in a pine cone shaped, which you can see in the carvings at Rennes-le-Château. Later was served in a round white wafer. Mm-hmm. And it's true, the skill to make the monoatomics was very much related to the skill to make a phase conjugate dielectric, which is what the Ark of the Covenant was. So the same physics that enabled the Ark of the Covenant to safely store their nuclear devices was the physics that enabled it to make the monoatomics, because you need a centripetal capacitance to stabilize the gold monoatom. And that's what the spark gap between the gold angel's wings was. It was a perfect, implosive spark gap. And that power spectrum made it electrically centripetal, and that's why you needed hygiene to deal with the Ark of the Covenant. So basically, the physics to make the electric field that causes a seed to grow is the same as the one to make an electric field to reduce radioactivity.
Mm. The number 9, I know, like Tesla mentioned, 3 to understand 3, 6, and 9 is to understand things. 9 seems to present itself very frequently, like in the Platonic solids. If you add up all of their angles and reduce it to a number, like you do as you do in numerology, 9 is always the number.
That's idiosyncratic to a base 10 numeric. But in plasma physics, the number 9 was discovered by Tony Peratt at Los Alamos Plasma Research. And what he discovered is that plasma toroids will self-organize 9 donuts, one above the other. And then he walked out in his parking lot and discovered the shaman had carved these things, thousands of years ago. And so my friend John McGovern in Australia began to co-author, because John had been reading the plasma language of ancient shaman for decades. And now they do all this work together, and all the animations are at goldenmean.info/whale dreamers. And you'll see that the plasma physics of 9 plasma donuts, which is why the Anunnaki and the Egyptians and the Greeks had the Ennead and 9 steps of the Palenque and the 9 roofs of the pagoda and the 9 steps of Dante's Inferno. And the fact that the politics of the Anunnaki family was 9 was simple, because whoever dominated, and that's why you had the 9 golden ratio tetra shadows in 3D to make the Sri Yantra, etc. So it was about the plasma physics of the self-organization of 9 toroidal plasma domains, and you literally have 9 chakras because there are 2. So it's all about 9 toroids of plasma.
Because I've seen in some of the things I've read, and including playing with music, I'm a musician. And for the longest time, I tuned, like everybody, I tuned my A to 440. And then I started tuning it to 432. And not only did I find it more pleasing to listen to, I found that that as a songwriter, I suddenly was tapped into a certain field that music just poured into when I tuned at that level. Do you have any insight into that kind of, there seems to be like almost like a discussion, we'll call it, regarding that kind of tuning?
It's very true that the A440 is not ideal, and it's related geometrically to the 60 hertz, which is a frequency at which the lowest voltage stops the heart, so it's obviously anti-biologic. So there are frequencies which are anti-biologic, but it turns out that you calculate those more accurately by Planck time exponent golden ratio called implosion sound. We have a detailed article on that in the harmonic series that eventually became the Theraphi, and it's on the cover of my book. It suggests other harmonics that are related there, but the actual academic research on 432 suggests that there's even better options, basically negentropic implosions, but it all starts with conjugating to Planck dimension. So you're quite right to emerge from the 440 tuning. That's very true. But the actual frequencies which allow brain waves to make bliss are very indicative. It's no coincidence that if you cascade the series that is exactly the Schumann harmonics, and you plot those on the alpha beta of the brain waves it takes to make bliss, that gives you a musical key signature. It's not exactly 432, but you're on the right track. But you need Planck dimensions to start with, because it's tuned to there.
Okay, I'll mention Planck in a second. One of the, with the Schumann frequency, which from what I know of, at least as historically, was 7.83. Is that correct?
That's right. The actual academic harmonics, and Greg Braden seems to have totally missed this, are 3 hertz, 7.83, 14.3, and 20.8. And they're very close to my equation, you see, and very close to the alpha beta. So the actual equation says now that we can fix the Schumann harmonics and we can stabilize our gravity and atmosphere now that we know what they're for.
Well, what grabbed me about the 7.83 number is that if numerologic, if you add that up, it comes out to a 9.
Well, that could be fun. But the actual way, remember, the moment at which numerology emerges from woo-woo into physics is when you predict wave mechanics.
Right, and it all serves to fatten the aura.
That's true. That's right. To fatten, exactly. And the point is, it makes the aura centripetal, and the more your aura becomes coherent, the more you become immortal. So that's exactly the issue. Right on.
When it comes to coherent fields, another person that kind of creeps in is Rupert Sheldrake and his morphogenetic fields. Now, I read The Science of Life, which unfortunately was written for scientists, so it's dry, much longer and involved than to me it needs to get once you wrap your head around a morphogenetic field. How do you, from your perspective, how do you see that this concept of kind of discrete fields for each species?
Well, I think that Rupert is a wonderfully sweet guy, and he's managed to interest a lot of people, and that, unfortunately, he appears to be clueless to the electrical engineering. The electrical engineering seems quite clear. It's called a phase conjugate dielectric. The original paper on that is called Allison Barium Titanate Land, and it revealed how a phase conjugate dielectrics, barium titanate, for example, behave like Alice in Wonderland. These plasma fields appear to be able to locate each other non-locally at a distance, remotely. And we now know why. Because when you create a phase conjugate field, it makes it inherently centripetal and self-organizing. For example, it's famous that ball lightning you can do telepathy with, and now we know why. So what he means by a morphogenetic field is actually a phase conjugate field. That's the only actual definition. And that's the actual physics of the collective unconscious, the communion of saints, and how to design a hospital and a burial ground and how to get born. It's all the same physics. And the term for that is fractal field. So when you translate that metaphor, and it's a beautiful loose metaphor in Rupert Sheldrake, into actual electrical engineering, you have devices like Theraphi and actual electric field generating technologies that go a lot more than philosophic metaphors. I'm not picking, I think Rupert Sheldrake, his lady there, I love them, they're sweet people. But excuse me very much, but when electrical engineers believe if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So we electrical engineers are very clear that if you don't know the electrical language, you can't speak with rigor about these things.
The morphogenetic fields to me in concept are self-organizing.
Exactly. Yes. And now that we have the frequency signature, we can build them. And Rupert did a good job of introducing people to that, but I suggest they study electrical engineering to get the real details.
Well, we can make it really practical and really simple, even without the electrical engineering, because phase coherence increases during heartfelt truth, right? So anything that brings you into resonance with who you really are. So according to your perceptions, that might be music, but anything that brings you into resonance with who you really are, how can our viewers use that and make that really just such a practical thought? Because I'm always encouraging them, look at you guys, take ownership and accountability with your thoughts.
Well, that's beautiful. And when I originally invented the concept of heart coherence and proved how to measure it mathematically, and then HeartMath took my idea and kind of screwed it up. But we updated that greatly. And the article on how we measure heart coherence is new now at hrv-app.com. And you can look with great rigor. We're now using a third order power spectra of the EKG and the heart rate variability to measure internal phase coherence, called internal cardiac coherence, which lots of people have tried to steal from me. But actually, we have the mathematics, it's clear and powerful, and it will be cheap on the iOS. So, but my original heart coherence measure was used in my original heart tuner, and it was functionally a lie detector doing exactly what you're describing. That when your internal phase coherence in your EKG goes up, it is the moment when you're speaking your truth. And the physics is clear because coherence is literally a wave that is shareable. And internal phase coherence is what we just happen to develop the mathematics to quantify, called a second and third order power spectra, or a spectrum. So what it means basically is your heart becomes a laser when you find a wave that's shareable. What that means psychologically is quite simple, that as you approach bliss or birth or death or tantra, for example, that basically you're inhabiting charge density. You're literally inhabiting a lightning bolt, like Daniel Brinkley or the movie Powder. And to inhabit a lightning bolt, every thought has to be perfectly shareable, which is a pure principle, which is charge distribution efficient. So if you think of something that you have anger about, for example, obviously it'll generate heat and you'll be thrown out of the center of the lightning bolt. So the ability to get your thoughts to the point where everyone is perfectly shareable is actually measurable in the internal EKG coherence. Your heart literally becomes a laser, and it's measurable.
And so then we could take that a step further, could we not, in talking in terms of shareable Kundalini experience or shareable Tantra, or it could be something as simple as all those children singing collectively and the impact that even has demonstratively on our son. And then that's reverberating back to us and back. Is that an impulse, an in-breath and an out-breath?
Exactly. And the mathematic physics appear to be that the climax form of coherence is called phase conjugation, where the maximum numbers of phases that can lock in phase together at once is then golden ratio phase conjugate. So climax form of coherence is conjugate. And yes, then you become centripetal, then you become embeddable. What it means is that your aura becomes more centripetal, so your little donut can add centripetal force to the bigger donut. So, we measured 11 different times, or it was measured 11 different times, that the solar flares were dramatically calmed and made peaceful when 1 million children sang the same song. But it's also been documented that when Tibetan saints die, you see rainbows. And the physics is that they added centripetal force to their environment. And that is the cause of rainbows. It's called phase conjugate origin of color.
Right. So I want to go to the Rainbow Warrior. That was prophecy. But really, to be accountable with our thoughts would be as simple as asking yourself, is this a shareable thought? Is this something that our ancestors and also 17 generations down the road is going to find useful?
Exactly. And probably, the study of the rules of football is not going to qualify, but the study of the pure principle about auras become immortal will qualify. So learning to recognize pure principle is exactly the issue. You're right. You're good. Yes. And
have you ever, I'm sure you have, but how have you considered, I want to teach this to our children.
Good.
Systems. Our pre-kindergarten kids should have already been experiencing this from mom and dad, but mom and dad don't know anymore. And so what's a simple way that we could begin to teach this at that level? I mean, we're not going to teach them physics, so we need something just really practical. Something.
Imagine the little boy goes down the roller coaster for the first time. His first time on a roller coaster. He gets off the roller coaster, and his eyes are wider than they've ever been in his life. And he says, "Mommy, I want to do that again and again and again and again and again." So that was the max peak experience for the little boy. The little boy is unconsciously aware that unless he reaches bliss, he will not get an immune system and he will not be immortal. So that little boy is already studying the physics of bliss, which is to say how to get all his attention into the present or phase conjugate at once. And if you don't get access to bliss, you don't get an immune system and you don't take memory through death. So it's the only real definition of culture is the ability to teach bliss to kids, actually. So by that definition of culture, and it's the only real definition of culture, Western people do not have culture. Indigenous people had culture because they knew the skill to teach their kids how to have bliss.
So we're talking the enduring factors bliss.
Exactly. That's exactly what we're discussing. Because once you have access to bliss, bliss is what comes after the internet in terms of education. It's the charge density, implosive aspect. You can ask any question. You have access to the collective unconscious. It is the internet of immortality, quite literally. So in physics, until you have a source of bliss, you are electrically a parasite because you do not have your own source of charge. Mm-hmm. So the hygiene for bliss is the only real subject that needs to be taught in school. But that's a beautiful subject because it covers everything.
And also what you just mentioned, parasites. I mean, the entities, the parasitic entities
Yes.
that can enter you through
Exactly.
Through pain, for example, through anything that causes the aura to bleed. So I don't know if anybody's ever even considered that, but that's another really accountable thought that people can engage.
Exactly. In fact, the physics of pain is literally the electric field that's bleeding charge due to broken fractality. It's the only definition of pain, which is why restored compression eliminates pain. And I have proved that because Theraphi eliminates virtually any localized pain in any person that's tried it. It's amazing. And long-term pain, we have a lot of success too. So we know exactly what pain is electrically, and we know how to fix it. It's restored compression or fractality. And so literally, yes, when you have access to bliss, your body is centripetal electrically enough that no parasite can survive bliss because all DNA, all plasma that's not shareable cannot withstand the implosion that bliss generates. So whether it's stomach parasites or astral parasites or ET parasites, it doesn't matter. If you can stay in bliss, you have no problem. So it does get back to the question of how do you teach the hygiene for bliss? That is the question.
And simple steering of the magnetism or the angle of light.
In fact, you do not have the choice to steer the plasma vectors from inside until you have access to bliss. So not only are you a parasite, but you're not self-steering because you're not implosive. So it still always gets down to access to the charge radiance, which results from charge implosion or bliss. So again, ability to be self-steering. So that's why people wanted parasitic religions, the God is outside me sickness, because they weren't ready to steer from within. Once you have access to your own source of bliss, you don't need a priest to tell you God's outside you. You, in fact, recognize the physics of creation called the divine, which is the divine principle, exists inside you electrically when you take responsibility for your own bliss process.
So we were talking pain on a physical level, but what we want to heal is also elements like depression, because depression invites those same parasites or creates holes in the aura. But the Theraphi would also mend that.
Well, we know for addiction and depression that the day you teach someone to make their brainwave alpha beta is the day they do not want the next drink of beer. It will make them feel sick. So they were on the wrong road to the right destination, which was bliss. And when you teach them the alpha beta frequency signature to implode, and they find that sharpness, literally the physics is as follows. When someone can make alpha in their EEG, then when they close their eyes, they see light. But if they can't make EEG alpha when they close their eyes, they see only dark. So what beer does, alcohol, is it helps them make alpha because the brainwave became more conductive. So it literally switches the lights on. So if you teach them how to make the frequency signature and the electrical geometry of bliss, which is a hygiene, the first day they're able to make their bliss from within, they won't want their addiction or their depression. And instantly, those are the exact frequencies we feed to Theraphi.
Mm-hmm. So those 10 or 12-step groups maybe would really benefit from hanging out with the Theraphi device.
The Theraphi would be good, and in combination with some neurofeedback. And yes. My teacher in brainwave neurofeedback on this is a world expert on this, started with cocaine, martywoodkey.com.
I like the concept of hygiene because it's a word I've used often when I explain things, because it's just kind of like a procedure, almost like washing your hands before you do certain things.
It's good, yes. And if we could see religion in those terms, that what religion was good for was teaching some hygiene. But once you understand the physics, then you do the hygiene because you understand the principle, and you don't have to have this idea about blind faith. No, faith doesn't need to be blind. You understand perfectly the physics, and that's why you do the hygiene. Mm-hmm. So the hygiene says, do not live in metal buildings full of electrosmog and bad air, because your aura will die and so will your soul. And do not send your kids to schools full of electrosmog and metal, because their soul will die also. So until you know, your architecture department knows why seeds die inside metal or aluminum cups, and they do. You should not send your kids to metal school buildings. And Steiner knew that very well. Children were only to touch natural wood and natural fiber and natural stone. And he intuited what a phase conjugate dielectric is. He called it etheric formative force. But basically, the thing is, you cannot inhabit any material which is not electrically centripetal, which is, say, breathes charge efficiently. So anything with a high dielectric constant that breathes charge efficiently allows your aura to breathe. In physics, that's called, you know, organic materials equals biologic architecture. It means your aura can embed and therefore breathe, and you can inhabit the space.
So dressing in hemp fabric, natural cottons, walking on leather soles.
Yeah, exactly. Grounding. The book Earthing, and even when Callahan originally measured life force in trees, the transducer he used was raw, unbleached hemp fabric, dipped in sea salt or living human sweat, made incredibly high dielectric constant. Put that on your scope, and you can measure which tree is hearing the Schumann harmonics, and that's which one is embeddable, and you know which one's going to survive.
Right. So now that brings me right into DNA as the organic superconductor, like able to store light and information.
That's right. We started with the center bond of every ladder rung of DNA, which is hydrogen, which I newly proved is fractal because 3 hydrogen radii exactly are my new equation. Okay. And so we know the hydrogen is fractal at the center of the DNA ladder rung bond. And then if you take the braid of the braid of the braid inside the braid, what happens is the top-down view of DNA is literally a dodecahedron that's stepped down a helix or slinky. So if you step the dodecahedron down the helix or slinky, you actually map the geometry of DNA. So effectively, DNA thread has 5 axes of spin symmetry because you have the cube, 3 axes, and then you embed the cube 32 degrees into dodec. It's 4 axis spin, which is the dodecahedron, is the 4th dimension, it's literally the hypercube. And then you ratchet the dodec down a helix, and you've mapped topologically DNA. It's beautiful. goldenmean.info/DNA manifesto, all the animations. So the thread of DNA has 5 axis spin symmetry. Now you take that thread and you braid the embedded coherently, which we've measured coherent emotion does. And so the thread, string, rope, fat rope, the plot thickens, and it eventually becomes toroidal. And you have 7 spins outside, 5 spins inside in DNA. Then it becomes literally toroidal DNA implosive, and that is called getting a soul. And it connects that communication device, which is called longitudinal wave physics.
And the communication device that we can then bring in would be the sacred alphabet.
If you take those 7 spins of the tetra and you look at the self-organizing golden spiral on the torus, and you index the tilt of that spiral on the torus by the 7 spins of the tetra, the shadows of that golden mean spiral on that torus are the Hebrew and Sanskrit alphabets, actually, which are simple propulsion vectors for the cube of space, which happen to be also the codons of DNA.
And so if your perception or your perspective is from inside, and depending on what angle you're looking at that, would that appear just as different frequencies? Can you hear that? Can you see that? Can you sense that in other ways?
Basically, what the alphabet is telling us is that physics is donuts nested in 3D. And that's a true statement for physicists. All charge is toroidal, so all physics is about donuts. And so if you know how to index donuts, you know how to make the atomic table for starters. Now, if you take this Sefer Bereshith, the first word of Genesis, and the Bereshith is simply this spiral from this point of view. So if you look from the outside and you see the spiral, you're actually seeing this shape, which is bait. And then you walk 1/7 away and you look to center, see Resh, etc. And then when you have made the 7th turn, you're on the inside looking out. The last letter of the word Bereshith, the at first in principle, the origin of thingness, first word of Genesis. All you've done is you've turned your mind inside out on the surface of a torus, which is called in the beginning, at first in principle, the origin of thingness. The physics of creation was the ability to turn inside out. So turning inside out-ness is the origin, yes, but it's the physics of symmetry.
Well, in many ways, because of the language that we're using, and I'm always trying to make it coherent to those who are listening. Yeah. So there was a phrase you used just a minute ago, and unfortunately I didn't write it down. It was something to do with toroidal. And I just thought that toroidal might be a phrase that a few people would benefit from having just be able to, to have it other than as a word, as a concept?
Well, it says that if in the self-organization of charge waves moving, the first thing that forms is a donut. Another way of saying that, which is a torus. Another way of saying that, I was just turning the light on so it'd be a little better lighting here. But another way of saying that is if you're a smoker, the only thing you can make is smoke rings. Mm-hmm. And that's true of physics, which is it's not new. And the other way of thinking about that is the fact that a torus has two vortex, which is otherwise known as string theory. So string theory and vortex theory and toroid theory is all the same thing. It's about getting two tornadoes or two pine cones to accurately kiss noses. And when two pine cones accurately do kiss noses, that's called phase conjugation. And that is the first time physics ever proved negentropy in optics.
Because what that triggered for me was ultra low frequency. Vacuum domains transmitting low frequency wave, but what I'm interested in from my own personal perspective is ultra low frequency.
Yes, no, that's the right question. Actually, when Sam in Bosnia began to document why 500,000 people were coming to his pyramid and were getting rejuvenation, he measured the low frequency infrasound, which we now know the perfect equation for. It's on the cover of my book. We know exactly what the frequencies need to be. It's called a phase conjugate pump wave. When the scientists first went down in the hypogeum under Malta and found out how they were using that for rejuvenation field, they found they were using it for infrasound focus. So to get the infrasound focused, you get the low frequencies in phase conjugate geometry. Now, obviously, if you do that precisely, phase lock to the high frequencies as well, which is it all starts with the Schumann harmonics, and then it embeds in the noble gases, et cetera, et cetera. And you get that all into phase. That's what Theraphi is.
Right, and that's what perhaps the pyramids were also so very functional for. Was that rejuvenation?
Yes, the idea of rejuvenation is very interesting there, the Shem unto the Lord, that, in physics it's called time reversal, but when physics says that a phase conjugate can make time reversal, they're very specific. You can time reverse rusted steel back to unrusted, but you cannot do the reverse, which means you can only do negentropy and not the reverse. Yeah. In other words, time reversal is only possible if you're going back to greater order. Now, this has very great implications for when we take a stem cell back to the fractal point and actually de-differentiate using Theraphi.
Yay for divine order.
The divine meant, perfectly branched or fractal. So, Shion, ion, science, to branch perfectly. John, a chip off the old block, perfect embedding, as above, so below. I am that I am. People were trying to learn what a fractal was. And then Einstein said, well, if I understood infinite compression, charge compression, I'd know what gravity is. And nobody told him what a fractal was.
So in the Emerald tablets, we have Edom Elohim, Sabrat Zeratim near your location in Arcadia Ego, and I'm sorry if I butchered that translation, but from the light I came to the light I return, or from the stars I came to the stars I return, and this is what bliss is all about.
Yeah, well, it's nice. Arcadia was a name for the Bohemian bloodline, which is Enki's line at an Arcadia, which originally was when the dolichocephalic skulls, they went from Egypt to Malta to Greece and then to South America, the coneheads. So Arcadia and the Bohemians refer to the same bloodline. And, as above, so below, and, the example I like to use for that is there's a certain time on history when in the architecture of star maps on the land, you have the star map of Orion on Giza and the star map of Alpha Draconis and in Angkor Wat, Heaven's Mirror, that there's a certain time in history when the star maps went from direct projection on the land to inverse projection. And there's a reason for that.
Right. Yes.
There's a point at which we go from being created by to turn into we become the creators. In other words, we re-inhabit the stellar spaces, the sun gods, which is another way of looking at the physics of why, 1 million kids can affect the solar flares, is because stars need something we make. We were not created, it took the sun a lot of work to make us. And by the way, we're overdue to gestate. No, the stars need the centripetal force we make desperately. We have a function to serve, which creates centripetal force, which is called inhabiting stars or sun god or Anu. So basically, any shaman who can't see through the eye of the sun like an eyeball hasn't grown up yet. And so our ability to grow up and inhabit stars is how we return, as you say.
Right, but we can also find, for example, the Ark of the Covenant within us, within our biological structure, and also within, say, the cosmos.
Yeah, well, the arc in that sense is also a metaphor for the perfect spark gap, which is to say the perfect conjugator, which is to say perfect implosion. And perfect implosion among waves is literally what makes you attractive electrically. So your ability to think a shareable thought and focus on it literally makes you electrically centripetal, and then you can move mountains.
Mm-hmm. Moving mountains sounds like good news.
You're the sword from the stone right then.
Yeah, oh, the sword from the stone. Oh, do tell, do tell.
Well, it's just that the stone is there a metaphor for charge in rotation, but which is, let's say, mass. but if charge is to emerge from the stone, the sword from the stone, the charge has to go in a line, which is, say, become energy. To translate inertia from the line to the circle and back, we now know the physics only golden ratio does, which is the only path from mass to energy, therefore. So to draw the sword from the stone is actually the physics of the ability to cause the charge to emerge from the stone. And the charge in that stone is not stupid. It will not come out of the stone or the mountain into your body unless it knows inside you it's going to find perfected distribution, because that's the only immortality for that wave.
So don't drive to the mountains in your car.
So don't think an unshareable thought if you want the mountain to send you its energy.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and maybe go barefoot up the side.
And the grounding is actually the book Earthing. It's about phase lock. All grounding is access to fractality for electricians and psychologists, which is perfected charge distribution.
I walk barefoot as much as I can, and on the ground.
Yeah, the thing is, if you walk barefoot on cement with steel bars in it, it's actually unhealthy. Because, and the reason you lose circulation in your feet because of the steel in your cement is because the capacitance is bleeding.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so then also that idea about living your life on a boat or sleeping over moving groundwater, for example.
That's right. The reason your aura dissipates when you are over an underground water vein is because your aura is always looking for a place to achieve distribution. So you can measure your aura collapse and so walking over underground water it can be interesting. You can measure the collapse in your aura just like at an eclipse. But sleeping over underground water moving is really bad news, for example. Good architects, geobiologists understand they make the wall there so you can't sleep over the underground water, for example.
So I've never heard you ever discuss in all of your prolific videos and so on that we're blessed with. I've never heard you discuss the E at the the Delphic Oracle, and perhaps I just missed that, or perhaps that's old news for you. But the E at the temple. Do you have any take or any interest in what that was there for? Or there was rumor that there were actually 3 of them. 555 EEE.
My understanding was that she was suspended in a tetrahedron over the vapor of the underground, which was literally climaxing the Schumann infrasound with the vapor hydrogen. And so she was literally able to use the plasma of the Earth as like an organ of perception into the sun. So the Oracle of Delphi had some meaning, true, the L of Phi. But I'm not sure about the E there. Generally, the sound E refers to harmonic exclusiveness, the sound A to harmonic inclusiveness. So E is a form of isolation, actually, which is why you say E when you're afraid of a mouse, and you say when you like dinner. E means exclude me, A means include me.
Well, that brought us back to hydrogen, but what about oxygen?
Oxygen seen clairvoyantly looks like a helix. It looks like a slinky. And the reason is because it's literally the stairway between valence electrons, OXY gene, which is to say O cross then branch Eugene, my middle name Eugene. So the reason oxygen efficiently allows valence electrons, it's called oxidation reductions, to move between shells non-destructively is because literally it's a slinky. And so we know exactly what oxygen is accomplishing in that sense. It's a braiding algorithm, quite literally.
I'd like to ask about the 12 strands of DNA.
We think that biologists probably laugh when the New Age woo-woos talk about 12 strands, and they should laugh, actually.
Right.
The physics is more clear, however, that in the thread that is DNA, we can prove there are 5 axes of spin symmetry. That is clear, and I just explained that. Now, if you take that thread of DNA and you braid the braid of the braid on the braid, thread, string, rope, fat rope, as it thickens, that's called embeddability. And at the climax form of that, at the 7th recursive braid embedding, the thread to string to rope to fat rope, the 7th time you do that, the DNA actually becomes, and we have the article toroidal DNA. This is all at goldenmean.info/DNA manifesto. So at that point, you do have 7 spins outside and 5 spins inside.
Which is 12.
So it's not 12 strands, it is 12 superposed axes of spin symmetry, which is the only possible definition of the 12th dimension, for example.
That's exactly what I was hoping to do, is again, we have these phrases that creep in from science into New Age woo-woo.
Right.
And people throw them around trying to sound as if like they're in the loop, but they're really in the meme.
It's good because it got us thinking about, but if we translate it into a rigorous language, which I say it as an electrical language, excuse me, as an electrical engineer, but then we know why when the scientists at Montauk supposedly wanted to determine which teenagers to abduct to steer the time chair, which became the movie Stargate, they called it Boson 7. It was a spectrum analysis of the DNA which indicated massive phase coherence, which indicates ability to lucid dream and travel in time, which is take memory through death, which is what the Draco, the Uru, could not do. So that gets us into that whole blood chemistry, the difference between, and I don't know if we want to go there, but.
Well, actually, my next question was about Rh negative blood.
Oh, well, good. So we could have a little fun here.
Yeah.
So the hypothesis was that part of the reason for the documented catastrophic aging of the Anunnaki, Nibiru, Uru, Nephilim, when they arrived here was because of the difference in blood chemistry. That their blood was a lipid, oil-based blood from a home star, starting in Alpha Draconis and then in Pleiades. And all the indigenous tribes know they came from Pleiades locally. So they had oil-based lipid blood. They breathed in nitrogen, breathed out cyanogen, and their electron transport mechanism metabolism was phosphorus-based. Red and white phosphorus became the red and the white bloodline, red and white Draco, the Red Cross and that. And so that created a situation where our atmosphere was a poison to them. Oxygen and water was a poison to them, which is the origin of kosher, actually, why they had to have the blood out of the meat, for example, in Dracos. So basically, if you understand a little bit about the blood chemistry, you understand that their access to bliss from their home star, they had electron transport from radioactivity. So when the Iradia couple in Russia documented born too close to Chernobyl turned out to metabolically adapt to high radiation environment, they were actually mutating backwards to a Draco blood chemistry, because we know they're called the oxygen wars, that if on your planet oxygen going down and radioactivity is going up, it means the Dracos are winning. Oops. So, and this metaphor became loosely tied to what you're referring to with Rh negative, because that when Enki Ra originally decided which monkey to clone, his name Nudimud meant the cloner, to make Adam and Eve, basically Takadama, which meant, a slave from Orion, actually Adama. Adam, it meant red, and Tak meant Orion, Mintaka, which is how they Takadama. So he chose the original monkey based on that's the first time he saw an animal or anyone actually exhibit compassion. And so the thing was that bloodline cross called Ebi Uru, and the Hebrew rabbi is correct. Hebrew means crossing over. They crossed the Ebi bloodline, Enki's mother, and Uru, Draco. But the thing was the reptilian blood was recessive. The monkey blood was dominant. Required inbreeding, et cetera, et cetera. You have the whole Rh negative story. So the cliche, and it is cliche, it's superficial, but it is true that we only love our dogs we only hug our dogs and our horses in UK. It's a fun joke, but it's true. The Rh negative was dominant in UK, which meant the rhesus monkey absent, which is what Rh negative means, which is passion. You don't see it, these are cliches. But so it is not to say that Rh negative blood means you're more reptilian, but it does tend to indicate the area of dominance. And the point was that actually those ancestors, the Dracos, could not achieve the physics of bliss that we can. So their problem, which was literally they had lost, it's called Nephilim to fall. They lost long-term memory and ability to take memory through death. Fortunately, they didn't have to die, details, but actually the skill to be able to die is something they forgot. Long-term memory loss, et cetera. So our physics, because we had an iron-based blood, which was radical and shocking for Enki. That's why he called us the red man, Skanda, Skandinavia, et cetera. So the iron-based metabolism was shocking and interesting to Enki. And the iron-based blood, which is literally symbolized by the lightning, was the bond to oxygen. So our ability to bond oxygen with iron led to an entirely new physics of access to bliss process, which gave us the possibility for a form of psychokinesis, literally how to get our plasma into stars, which is the vaccine for the Orion Wars. Now that is the article, fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood.
I feel very well satisfied with that answer. My mother was an Rh negative hazel-eyed woman.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when Pogo said, we have met and encountered the enemy and it is us, maybe he was referring to the reptilians. We needed a good shot of Draco and Uru reptilian blood in our spine, and the amygdala from which the juice to make Kundalini possible is literally the mouth of the snake brain. So we needed to cross the snake brain to the bird brain to have the psychokinetic possibility. So we're grateful to have Draco ancestors, and of course they had problems. So do we.
Shelley, do you have anything?
No, well, we could keep him here for hours and hours. I would really love to touch on the tantric process, but what he was just talking about was the...
we can take a break here because we do take breaks. And so anyway, we're going to take a quick break as we have been doing recently, and we'll be right back.
Global Mission of Peace is a worldwide team of like-hearted individuals focused on a new paradigm of unity, peace, and understanding.
Unity with all people across all borders.
Peace with every faith and religion.
Understanding the true nature of the political, financial, and power structures of our world.
Our focus is not in changing these structures, but in offering a new reality, a new consciousness. Don't you think it's time?
Okay, well, we're back from our break, and we're here with Dan Winter and, of course, Shelley, my co-host. And we want to speak a little bit about cerebral spinal fluid, its importance, and for those of you who have heard the term craniosacral therapy, this ties in very much with that concept. The man Upledger, who wrote the book on craniosacral therapy, and was trying to write it for chiropractors and doctors, so it gets a little bit involved for other people, but his own understanding was very deep, and he spoke of feeling a pulse that ran through the body that tied in with this cerebral spinal fluid distribution in the body, and being able to feel this pulse was he called the inner doctor, where the adjustments you might make in the body to help the cerebral spinal fluid move through the body could affect great healing. Or correction in the body. Can you speak to that at all, Dan?
It's a beautiful introduction. Very well said. Thank you. And yes, I was the invited speaker at the Polarity Therapy Conference on this in Colorado. And then actually the Sacrocranial Upledgers group invited me to speak at their conference in Iceland on this. We did it in the Blue Lagoon. It was steamy. So lots of background here. But yes, actually what Upledger documented was that if your spine liquid is pumping, it is clinically impossible to be depressed. And this fit into my background. I work with Bentoff as he was writing the book on the biophysics of Kundalini, Stalking the Wild Pendulum, where he had measured the spine liquid frequencies, phase-locked the ventricles to the upper cortex. And so I had the chart from Bentoff, and this is all in my book, where the ringing in the ears heard by meditators, he measured the frequencies, used audio oscillators, and got the chart of the Sangreal, Song in the Blood, sound current, it's called. You hear this ringing. And sometimes we even know what ancestors are phoning by the which ear is ringing. But then Bentoff showed that was in phase with the low HRV heart frequencies, because there's a phonon standing wave to the aortic crotch, like a long violin string, which Bentoff proved on his capacitive accelerometer. And this was intro to the biophysics of Kundalini, and I worked with him in his lab there, and I was a psychophysiologist and a polygraph builder. Anyway, so then when I began to teach with the sacrocranial schools, and I realized that the long tidal and the short tidal, and there are 4 specific low frequencies in the spine liquid pump. And I came to discover, and that's a new chart and a new graphic in my book, which you can't see very well here, but it's on page 13. And basically, the low frequency tidal frequencies in the spine liquid pump, which is the physics of sacrocranial and literally Tantra as well, turn out to precisely fit my equation, Planck length and time times exponents of golden ratio, meaning the spine liquid pump drives the brainwave frequencies into the bliss because both are a precise phase conjugate negentropic collapse wave, literally implosive. And we know now what Tantra is, and Kundalini, Tantra, and Bliss had all this exact same physics, very measurable. Bentoff did it with capacitive accelerometrics, and this Upledger school does it with skull clamp accelerometrics, which I helped design some of through Marty Woodkey. And it's all a matter of measuring the low frequency infrasound in the body. And when this becomes all massively locked into phase, it's literally introducing embeddability, which is implosion of a little donut's ability to nest non-destructively inside big donuts, called embeddability. And obviously golden ratio phase conjugation optimizes that process. And the reason that's the physics of Tantra is because that's how you add the inertia of your centripetal force to your lover, actually. It's also the physics of group meditation, et cetera, and non-destructive compression. Interestingly, that the Tantra school in LA, William Golden, the founder of Yoga Journal, used my heart tuner invention for their Tantra school specifically because it taught this massive phase lock, which in kinesiology is called, neuro-linguistic program is called micromotion entrainment, which is basically optimized to embeddability. So it's a beautiful way to think about bliss and Tantra in physical terms and to make it teachable.
Well, I happen to be a licensed massage therapist, and I've also specialty in medical massage. But most importantly, it's my shamanic sense of the body that I get my readings and then use the kind of the exoteric knowledge to work with energies.
That's beautiful. Yes.
And so when I was learning craniosacral therapy, now I'm somebody who can actually palpate and feel chakras.
Wonderful, wonderful.
But
yes.
I have never yet quite picked up on that pulse or that pump of the craniosacral, the CFS. Cerebral spinal fluid.
Actually, our new programmer for iThrive is a world leader in teaching people to feel the sacrocranial. In fact, that's one of the reasons he wrote the software, was to help people feel the sacrocranial pump. You can, if you go to hrv-app.com, and the link there is to Patrick Botti in Belgium, who was the programmer for all our new iOS apps. And that's how he started this, was teaching people how to feel the sacrocranial using biofeedback. So basically what you do is you got the low frequency, the LF component of the heart rate variability, which turns out to be 0.1 hertz, which turns out to be identical with the Mayer wave, the famous natural resonance frequency of the blood pressure system, which turns out to also be exact golden ratio exponent Planck length and time phase conjugate collapse. And so as you teach people to read the Mayer wave and to actually measure the LF component of HRV, and there's 2 ways to do that cheaply on an iPhone with just the camera light. You'll see it on the new app.
What does HRV mean?
Heart rate variability, heart rate, which is the most studied topic in all of medicine, period, because it is so indicative of immune health. So basically, which is basically the reason why iOS is going in the biofeedback direction. But the point I was going to make was that one of the ways the sacrocranial practitioner knows they felt the low frequency is because the practitioner is adding the centripetal force of their aura plasma to that of the patient. So in South Spain, when we had these traumatized kids, and you'd have 6 and 8 sacrocranial practitioners holding points on the body of one child for like 8 hours. And these kids were unrecognizably healed afterwards. The physics was because they were adding such dramatic centripetal force. And the way that's measurable, as you know, in the sacrocranial teaching, is that the spine liquid pump goes to the still point, 0 point, called healing crisis. Another name for that is phase conjugate still point, because it then emerges more harmonics locked in phase coherence, namely more ordered or negentropic. Interestingly, one of the first reasons that Patrick documented this was he was measuring the Theraphi effect on HRV with the new 8-hour overnight feature, which we have with the chest strap in the new app. And he discovered you have long-term heart rate effect, including metabolic increase, and that the Theraphi experience almost invariably helps people get to a 0 point, still point, in the spine liquid pump, a phase conjugate point.
Because I read an interesting letter that somebody had written to Upledger. It was a practitioner, and he was talking about sometimes having his arms and hands under the body of somebody on their back, and how that when he was there for long periods of time, there would be some blood flow would be cut off, and so he would lose the part of your nervous system that's tactile, because the pressure receptors tend not to go to sleep. But the more, as many people don't know, the nervous system, there's all kinds of receptors. They're like different antennas. And each one can perceive heat, cold, some do pain, some do pressure. And so what Upledger had responded was that actually the fact that his hands or arms were falling asleep was good, because the receptors that were left still able to perceive would give him more accurate information. That much of the other neural information he was getting is what Upledger called noise.
Well, the pure plasma part of the aura still penetrates. It's like the ghost in the Curlian photograph, So that's a very interesting thought, actually. But that is beautiful, that the long-term ability to stay in phase with someone, which is also related to Tantra, is related to the ability to add centripetal force to someone else's aura. The joke we had at my father's family business, Electric Motors, was, my father never really understood how to solve the repairman's problems in the motor shop. But if he went over and looked over their shoulder and just looked at the problem, just his physical presence there, suddenly they would have an aha and think, oh, now I know. And all he did was add centripetal force to someone else's aura.
The little bit I remember about the techniques in craniosacral also was counterintuitive, where in certain cases where there was tension, you might think to expand it. In craniosacral, it's to softly nudge towards. It's almost like if you felt like that you should pull, instead you should push, was the concept, which is different than normal body working, where often when with stretching muscles, you're looking to almost like if you were to take a rubber band, and you wanted to lengthen it, you would stretch it, you'd pull it out. And which informs some of my body work techniques, because there's a lot of pressing in deep tissue work for releasing. And I always said, if you wanted to stretch out, or if you wanted to lengthen a rubber band, would you press it or would you pull it?
And really, it's true that restored compression, which is to say to get maximum pressure, actually gets you to the point of maximum sorting. The physics of rebirthing is like that if you didn't get the maximum squeeze in the birth canal, you can't sort memories through birth, which is why Caesar made war on the Druids, basically, because he never got a birth canal called cesarean section. So the birth canal actually is a compression path that maximizes into golden ratio in duration, the same as the physics of the centric waveform for love. So actually restored compression moment is to restore the ability of the body to naturally do its own self-sorting. So it is about the perfect squeeze. That's true.
Well, I think it makes for a show, don't you think, Shelley?
I think for now, however, we do have some very good news for our good news section. Would you like to share that?
We always do good news at the end of Mystic View. The good news is, one of the good news is we got Dan Winters on our show, Dan Winter. But more good news is we do have other shows. We have The Circle, and one of the hosts there's two hosts, Morgan and Linda has become really very much enamored of Dan Winter's work. And so the good news is, Linda, Dan Winter has agreed to be on the Circle Show. And so that's the good news. Just generally, there'll be more Dan Winter on GMOP TV.
And there's a lot more good news. All the good news you want is at fractalfield.com. You pop over and check that out, because Dan's new book, the new devices that he was referring to that are coming out for iOS.
We have all the links there at fractalfield.com, and also fractalu.com, the Fractal University, will soon have a new curriculum. So we're trying to make this shareable wave, and we thank you guys a lot for being so shareable. And I'm really pleased to meet you, and I really appreciate your knowledge of sacrocranial. You guys been doing your homework, and it's wonderful to do this as a team. That's great, really. Thank you.
That's what we like to do with Mystic View, is to enter our mystic selves. Which is to be connected to the divine, in my opinion, and then try to bring coherence through speech to that cosmic thought. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Shelley. And thank you to all our listeners. And we'll see you for the next Mystic View.
Blessings. Thank you.
And
stay in
God
touch.
bless.
It's been a blessing. Thank you. Okay.